everyone, welcome to another session of Kaffeine Karrots. Today we have Morika Georgieva with us. Welcome, Morika.
Hi, Anshi. Very nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I'm very sure Morika is known to most of you. She is Director CS and Technical Services at Permutive. And this is her recent promotion. So congratulations to you on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So while we've interacted several times, I think one topic that is favorite for me, and I think for Morika as well, is onboarding. And today we want to talk about onboarding, specifically in high touch engagements and not really generic onboarding or tech touch onboarding. So to begin with, let us just hear your definition of onboarding, Morika.
Great question, and definitely a topic that's very close to my heart as well, especially at Permutive. We're fortunate for our clients, the majority of them, to be quite high touch, so we don't have a choice but to conduct our onboarding as so. I actually had a lot of thinking around what onboarding means and how we define it, because every company that I've been a part of has a slightly different definition. So arriving to something that is umbrella enough to serve everyone universally can be quite a challenge. I would focus it though on that notion of equipping your customers to get the most value from your product. So the onboarding for me is that process of getting your customer to a stage where they're equipped to get maximum value from your product. And in order, I think that definition is helpful because it allows us to focus on the right things in order to conduct that onboarding successfully. So understanding what the prerequisites for your customer to get value from the product are and design the onboarding around them.
Wonderful. So if we kind of put it in a framework, then how would you differentiate between onboarding, handoff, training, implementation?
Yeah. It's interesting, right? Because in customer success, we tend to throw those words around a lot, for sure. The one thing that I'd probably put slightly to the side, although it's very related, is the handover or the handoff. So that process of the sales team providing the customer success team, the onboarding team, whoever it is that does the onboarding, with enough information for them to successfully onboard that customer. I will call it a process. It's not a point or it's not an action. There needs to be preparation. There needs to be a discussion around it. There needs to be an end of that process where the customer success and onboarding team clearly states, yes, I'm ready now to take that customer over. So I think it's important to think of the handover as a process rather than as a point of time. Implementation to me brings to a more kind of limited operation or action. So for example, you might implement a given product, you might implement a feature, a module, you might even implement a piece of best practice that your customer success manager has advised you on. And I guess what we can look at onboarding as is a series of implementations that come together to achieve a series of core outcomes that then complete your onboarding process. So I kind of see them as all of these elements that you mentioned, your handoff, your implementations, your training sessions, all of those come together to complete a successful onboarding.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So one thing, specifically because we are talking of high touch engagements, high touch engagement essentially means you are engaging with customer more often, more in person or online meetings you're doing. That actually gives an opportunity for customer to kind of bring their viewpoints quite a bit, or maybe they're not ready for certain aspects that you wanted to cover. So the potential to digress from what you set to achieve for are high. So how do you suggest one should manage that or organize it in a way that the way you have defined onboarding continues to progress?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I actually would take a couple of steps back and even have that conversation with yourself or with your team about, do you want to be the one that defines 100% of what onboarding means? Or, especially in a high touch scenario, do you want to have the conversation with the client to understand in this early stage what onboarding might mean to them. And I think in a high touch scenario, we have usually the resource and the time to have that conversation and to be a little bit more flexible. So you might want to adjust that definition to the customer that you're working with ever so slightly. Why? It could be, for example, that the customer that you're working with is not deploying that type of product for the first time, right? So you're a customer success tool, we're a data management tool, we're not the only such tools on the market. It might well be that our customers are coming from competitive tools. They've done this before, they know exactly what they want to achieve. Let them tell you. Then talk to them about what your definition of success in onboarding is, what your customers have achieved, and try to find a joint definition that both parties feel means success. For example, it might well be that usually the elements that you focus on, Primitive is a data management platform, so the elements that we focus on first is extracting all the core pieces of data from a customer's website and then allowing them to build some core audiences. We have had customers who have focused on doing some integrations first, or focusing on an API stream before they deploy something on their own websites. They know their infrastructure best. If they have priorities that don't align exactly with what you expect onboarding to look like, have that conversation. And I think importantly, I'm not suggesting that we blindly go with the customer's project plan and timelines, but try to understand, why is this important to them? It could be that it's supporting a very vital function for their business that they just need to make sure it's their top priority and it's functional before they do anything extra. Get that understanding before you apply 100% of your project management approach. Outside of that, so assuming that you do have an understanding of what matters to your customer, I think there's a couple of things before and then during the onboarding process that we can do in order to stay on track and to make sure that people are moving at the same pace on both yours and your customer side. Before the start, there's three things. The first one is just to set very clear working group roles and responsibilities, and that's set clear roles and responsibilities on your side. You might have a few different teams that step into that. At Primitive, we have commercial and technical teams that are part of the onboarding process. So the customer is likely to interact with quite a few people during that time. Be very clear about what each of those people is going to do, what they can expect from you, but be very clear about what you expect from your customers' roles as well. I've seen a lot of like onboarding slides making reference to, on your end, we want a project manager, we want an executive sponsor, and we want a DMP owner or a platform owner. What does this actually mean? Project manager can mean different things in different organizations. What are the activities that you expect that person to be accountable for when they come on your weekly or bi-weekly call? It could be things like, this is the person that I'm going to expect to unblock timeline elements on the customer side if we get stuck. Or from an executive sponsor perspective, I'm going to come to you if things begin to digress or if things begin to slow down. Say that if somebody on your team hasn't completed an action, like you're going to be an escalation point, say that to the executive sponsor, get that buy-in so that if things do get a little bit awry, you can go back to the executive sponsor and say, listen, those timelines are now at risk because of these factors. I need your help. Do you want to change those timelines, or do you want to change the behavior of your team so that we get back on point there? So just being very clear about who does what and within what timeline is very important. Be clear about the investment of resource and time ahead of that starting point, and understand how long your customers have to complete that, and explain how long you are going to be around to complete that. So especially if you're if you're working in a tool that requires development resource on your customer side, that development resource very often is not going to be there forever. Usually those engineers are going to be available for a spring or two. Understand how long they're going to be around for. have that conversation. Similarly, saying to them, it could be that your SOW specifies that your customer has access to technical resource for the first 8 to 12 weeks of onboarding. Define that again in the kickoff. It might well be that the people that you're onboarding your tool with haven't read your SOW. So don't assume that everybody has the same level of knowledge as you do. Just make it very, very clear. And the third one is ask the customer themselves, like, what are the risks? What has gone wrong in previous onboarding that they've done? What do they think might be difficult for their organization? And just be mindful of that thing about how you can mitigate it. That's like the before element, and I guess during the onboarding, there's also things that you can do. Obviously, keep track of what's happening, have a task tracker, project plan, something that you can update and the customer can update, and make sure that you see the same thing. It's very important that you're not missing that information. And be very clear on when you should be escalating and what your point of escalation is. This is why you have an executive sponsor. Make sure you pull them in at the right times. And before you do this, obviously make sure that everything on your end is buttoned up. But yeah, those are the things that I think, if over time your team is going to start developing an intuition of when things are going to start digressing, as you mentioned, try to teach them to step in before that has actually happened and mitigating that risk.
Wonderful. So basically what I hear from you is expectation setting, both in your team as well as customer, really understanding what their expectation is, also explaining the expectation that you had from them. Setting up all, bringing everybody on the same page should be the basis before you initiate your onboarding. Because if customer or you're digressing, then if you have not done the expectation setting, then it's hard to communicate because you do not really know what you, or they may not understand what they are digressing from. So that makes entire sense. Wonderful, and thank you for that good explanation with examples. So if we have to just chart out or list out top areas of pitfall in onboarding, where usually onboardings fail or what people miss out, despite maybe even if folks are aware that this might be the area, but this is one of the key areas. Would you like to highlight that?
Yeah. In my experience, and actually I know that SmartKarrot is an onboarding tool, so I'd love to see what you think here as well. To know you're a fountain of knowledge around onboarding. I've seen maybe 3. There's so many, right? But like 3 that are most ubiquitous. The first one, and it relates to your first question, is what is actually onboarding? And be very clear to your client what onboarding means. Agree on that before you start and when it ends. Especially in more technical products, like Permutive is a quite a technical product. You run the risk, because the changes that you make to the product can quite often require engineering resource, or they could be adding additional functionality or changing functionality or adding additional use cases. If you're not defining this at the start, you risk that you run the risk of creating the impression that you're in endless onboarding, and the customer not constantly going back to their onboarding resources and people because this is who they know. At Primitive, for example, we try to be very clear. There is the first phase of onboarding we try to complete for the vast majority of our plans around within about 8 weeks. And that is a very particular type and piece of JavaScript code is going to be deployed on the site. And these are the things that you're going to be able to do once we have done that. That is on your onboarding. Things on top of that, we can continue working on, but that's not your onboarding. Right now, you have what you need from the tool to begin getting value out of it and to make money. So not defining that runs, like I said, the risk of indefinite onboarding. And the problem with that, there's a few problems with that. The first one is that come renewal, your customer might actually say, oh, wait, it actually took us 10 months to onboard. We were told in the sales cycle, it will take us 2. Okay, it didn't actually, but maybe you understood onboarding very differently to how we define it. Or we didn't have that conversation at the start. The second one is your resources internally are just going to get overwhelmed, because if you're not taking onboarding processes off your onboarding team's plate, at one point by the end of the year, you're going to have people running 30, 40 onboardings at the same time, all of them at different points. And these people are going to get completely overwhelmed. Ultimately, the quality of their delivery is going to suffer. The second big pitfall that you're running is not explaining to customers what you expect them to do and within what timeline. If you're relying on your customers to do particular deployment, define particular areas, or bring in particular parts of their team into the conversation, and they're not doing it, if you go to them and you say, hey, like, I expect you to do X, Y, Z, and you haven't done it, the customer is always going to default to, but you didn't tell me I had to do that. I bought this tool because they told me it was really easy deployment and onboarding. No one told me I had to do something like this. A lot of people here would say, wait, well, it's the sales team area of focus to explain those and to prepare the customer. I half agree with that. Yes, your sales team should be setting the right expectations about the resource and that should be available and at what point. We should be reaffirming those expectations at the point of starting the onboarding, so that the customer, like, there's the time between agreeing to purchase a tool and actually signing a contract, there's a big lapse in there. Sometimes contract negotiations can take a few weeks or sometimes even a few months in those big organizations cases. Don't assume that everything that your sales counterpart has said 2 months ago is going to stay in those people's brains. Be very clear and very specific.
Agree. I love the point that you raised, that sometimes you think onboarding is over, but customer assume that onboarding continued for a few more months, and at the time of renewal, they are not very happy saying the onboarding was too long. I really like that part. And to your point, the way at least we are doing is, again, reiterating what sales would have mentioned, the key expectation of a resource requirements and otherwise from their end, data readiness from their end. And customer success, as we all understand, is quite comprehensive. Somebody can be looking for something as simple as just get me a account 360 view for all my customer data, because for me it's scattered all over. Somebody may want to improve their onboarding time, and some may want to get better renewal rate, so on and so forth. So the way we function is we at least chalk out one or two key requirements. It can be as basic as getting your account 360 view, bringing everything together, or it can be as important as getting your higher improved NRR. So whatever it is, really depending on customers' readiness, we chalk out during the initial phase of onboarding, and then we set on from there. And to your point, the communication on regular basis, ensuring where we are today, whether we are on time or delayed, is something we really, really have to maintain that. So the onboarding plan kind of, obviously it goes under some changes, but it stays visible to customers as well as to us. So it really helps. This actually brings me to the another question, which is very pertinent, and it, I understand, may vary across organizations. Who really owns onboarding? Multiple teams, CS team, onboarding team. What do you think is the best combination?
Yeah. Great question. That, as you say, might differ from between organizations. The all beautiful things in life, my answer is going to be it depends. But the one thing that you need to make sure happens, I think, is that someone owns it. Onboarding is a tricky part of the customer lifecycle. I'm not even going to go into how important it is. I think we all know, but it's a tricky part because there might be an enormous amount of people involved. If you don't have ownership and accountability of that process, it's going to be really easy for that hot potato to be thrown around if, God forbid, things go awry. At Pernitive, we have ownership of the onboarding shared between the customer success manager and our technical solutions engineers. And the reason why this is shared is because there are very clear technical and non-technical prerequisites for our customers to get success out of our platform. The technical ones are connected with getting the call-in page, ensuring that the customer receives guidance that's very specific to their setup, has all their technical questions answered. So the skill set that we need for that is somebody who's very technical, who has experience with the deployment of JavaScript and so forth. Then there's we call them the commercial elements, which is a different skill set. It more falls within a CSM remit, and importantly, the people that that we speak to from a commercial perspective tend to be very different. The people that we speak to from a technical perspective. So from a commercial perspective, we do things such as understanding what doesn't quite work in the advertising sales department of our customers, why they decided to switch and what they have struggled with in terms of taking their audiences out to sell them to advertisers, because we operate in that space, and making recommendations as to, once all of that onboarding is complete, how we have seen our customers taking that data, taking it to market and making money out of it. So those two things are very separate because they require separate skills and they work with different stakeholders, but they're obviously related because you can't have this without this one. So what I would say is that because of that joint ownership, those two teams internally need to work very, very closely together, so that they can achieve the outcomes that the customer is looking for. And I will say that if there's one kind of element that we do find a little tricky to manage sometimes, it is that joint ownership and staying aligned the entire time, making sure that the data that we're seeing about the progress of that customer's onboarding is the same across both the CSM and the TSE, understanding that on like commercial and technical onboarding, how do we link them together so one doesn't end within 8 weeks and then the other one goes on for another 6 months. So those are intricacies that come from the fact that we have so many different elements to that onboarding that we are bound to have two different teams owning that. So that's a big lesson that we've learned over the past few years. I have been at organizations where implementation and onboarding is an entire separate team that onboards the customer and then transitions to onboard someone else. I think that is better suited to products that are highly configurable. There are, say, if it's a CRM or recruiting CRM or an ATS, like products that from one customer to the other might look completely different because they're solving different problems, and the correct implementation to drive the outcomes that the customer is looking for is an art of its own, takes a long time, takes its own discovery and so forth. In those cases, you might want to have a team that specifically focuses and specializes in understanding what your customer is trying to achieve, setting up the system to do so, and then ensuring that QA and all of those things are run so that the customer can get value as quickly as possible. Those complex implementations that run a lot of risk because of that customization, I think that kind of warrants its own implementation team. But as I said, whatever you decide to do, just make sure that you have very clear ownership so that you know if things do go wrong or if things go really, really well, who you should go to find out more.
Wonderful. So now the way you presented, at least two teams are accountable for onboarding in different capacities though. So this brings me to the obvious point of tracking metrics and progress. But I want to tie two things together here. And one, we all talk about customer success, the objectives that customers have to achieve, the value that they have to derive by virtue of using a product or service. How do we bring that or tie that in onboarding? And this also comes to the another most popular term in customer success, time to first value. So where does that fit in? And with all that background, multiple team, the value, customer success, eventually what should be the key metrics or the KPIs that teams should track for onboarding?
Yeah. Time to value is such a favorite topic of mine. Over time, I'm not, my thinking of here has developed very much, and I still am not sure for myself how I feel about this metric overall, because what I've seen in a lot of businesses is that time to value has different definitions between teams, and even between the customer and your own team, because those different teams are responsible for various outcomes. So let's see, in our case, our technical team is responsible for successfully deploying a piece of code on the customer website, and that code pulling in data. At that point, the customer has the tangible part of the product working for them perfectly. So they should be getting value. However, there's a lot of tools, actually the majority of tools that I have come across, that your product working well for you doesn't always mean that you're getting value from that product. You'll know for yourself in customer success tools, the tool probably works perfectly. There's no bugs, everything is running great. If there's nobody that's coming in to log into that tool, to look at the data and to take action based on that data, then that time to value metric that your technical team cares about, that goes out the window. It doesn't matter. So I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with that time to value metric, because even we can measure when the product is fully functional. And I think that's why technical and services teams are so tied to that metric of this is when the product is up and running, because we can see it and we can control it. What we can't always control 100% is what your customer actually does with that. That is, we can do a lot of enablement. We can understand what they need. We can understand where their focus lies. There is a point in which, if that organization has made the decision to purchase a particular tool, which maybe stops to align with their strategy, or stops being a priority, or maybe they realize that it's not the right thing for them and they don't use it, their value goes out the window. But even if they do go ahead and use it, quite often you will depend on metrics from your customer or reports from your customer that comes in and says, I took the data or the output that your tool gave me, and I did X with it, and I got some value. And that point of tracking what your customer does with the tool is where I've seen an enormous amount, certainly all the businesses that I've worked with, beginning to break a little bit, and beginning to see a little bit of risk, because we can't always have complete visibility into how our customers' businesses function. So I guess that's not 100% answer your question, but I think that I'm not saying don't measure time to value, but be very aware whether that is value from your perspective or from the customer's perspective. That could be a prerequisite for the customer to get value, but it's not going to be the end goal there. So I think this is where things like the elements that you mentioned at the start, such as the objectives and the goals of the customer, really come into play. So being very clear from the sales team and during the start of onboarding, understanding why did this customer purchase what they purchased, and in a high touch scenario, you usually would have the time to do that discovery. Why did they purchase that tool? What are they going to do with it? And how are they going to measure whether what they're doing with it is actually happening? That could take 100 different formats and 100 different views, depending on the product that you have and how you're working with them, how you're working with it. But make sure that you have an understanding of it and you understand what value means for your customer, not just for you.
Agree. Beautiful. I like that aspect, because this, I think, is not easy to really get back to and ask, what did you do? Were you able to achieve what you had set out for? So it's a wonderful thing. Now, if we move slightly on the resources side, and we did talk about multiple teams being responsible for onboarding in their own capacities, obviously depending on the nature of it. But then if we speak more on the business side and leaving the technical teams accountable for part of onboarding aside, what are the key skills that you suggest team members should have in order to be a good onboarding specialist?
Yeah, really great question. Your most organized people are going to be your best onboarders. People who love process. If you hire, whether that be a CSM or anybody on your team, and they say to you, I love having the rules laid out in front of me and following them, that's somebody who's going to be good at onboarding. Those folks who are really process driven and who look at an activity and your business, and they're going to come and they're going to ask you, what's the process for X? It feels like everybody is doing this particular activity within our team differently. I'd like to create a process for it. Great. Like those operational mindsets, those are going to be really, really good onboarders. So that operational mindset, that's an important skill. Effective questioning is another very key skill, I think, at that point. During onboarding customers, where we have this, I think most tools would have this element of requirements gathering. So these are the things that we want to achieve and do with the tool. Customers are going to tell you that they want a lot of things, and often they're going to come to you with solutions or functions or buttons that they think that they've decided they need. They probably do, but when people talk about solutions, often our understanding of it could be different. People who understand the why behind customer requests and who have the question banks and the questioning skills to get to that are very good onboarders as well. And that's crucial, because if we put in a lot of requests by the customer during the time of onboarding without realizing what they're actually trying to achieve, that can really come to bite us towards the end. Often people who are very good collaborators and who can create a business case for what they need on a daily basis. During onboarding, you are probably going to need a lot of problems to be solved, things that maybe you didn't always foresee. As a result, you're going to need somebody who can effectively go to, whether that be the salesperson or the solutions engineer that solved the deal, your engineering team, or even your executive team, and get solutions to their requirements fairly quickly. So you need someone who can be very clear at, I need X, this is what I need, why I need it. If I don't get it, this is the risk. If I get it, this is the opportunity. People who can go and like solve those problems efficiently for themselves. So I guess it's a very interesting set of skills, because you need folks who can stick to process and repeat it and not get bored of repeating that process, but also who are quick thinkers, and as problems present themselves, they know where to go and when to find those solutions.
Lovely. I like the clarity, the way you laid out the key skills required for good onboarders. So, ending this conversation, if there is one thing that you would want to tell to folks who want to get into onboarding, what is it that you would share with them?
It's a really great question. I would ask them to have a conversation with themselves about what they want from their career, as anybody that would be there. But I think onboarding is very specific, because it requires you, it kind of sits in between solution sales and success in a way, and need you to like require skills for all of those different elements. But it also comes with a few, not pitfalls, but a few elements that I don't think people that get into onboarding always consider. One of them is that a lot of people in onboarding would come from customer success or solutions, and they're relationship builders. Consider that that relationship building will be important, but it's not going to be long term. You're likely going to build some of those relationships, get really close to that client, and then you're going to have to move away and go to the next one. So that's more a sales type of relationship building than customer success. The other type is like, if things are going well, and if you're doing your job really, really well, things can get a little repetitive. Be mindful of that. So you need to be somebody who finds initiative and continuously looks for problems to find and processes to optimize. And then the third one is like, be prepared to collaborate with pretty much every team on the company and to ask things of them, because you need to deliver quickly. So work on your persuasion skills for sure, because they're going to be very, very necessary. Quite often it's going to be tricky and to create that business case, because you're not coming from sales where you're saying, I need X so that the business can get 700K in revenue, or I need Y because otherwise this customer is not going to renew. You're right in between of that. So your business case is about the risks and the opportunities within what you're asking for need to be very, very clear. So I guess this is not just one thing, but if I need to like put an umbrella around this is like, be very clear that this is not customer success and it's not sales either. It is something in between, and you're going to have to be flexible to adjust itself to the outcomes that you're trying to drive for customers.
Beautiful. As always, amazing discussing on onboarding. So wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Morika. I loved all the points that you brought up. Thank you.
No, thank you, Anshi. It's been such a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you.